officially open.
This is draft season presented by Moody's, a proud partner of the New York Giants. Decode risk, unlock opportunity. Learn more at Moody's.com. John Schmeelk, Tony Pauline from Sportskeeda. I am fresh off about a day and a half. Arrived on Monday morning around 2 a.m. back from Munich with the New York Football Giants. Fun trip. It's good to be back with you, Tony, talking about draft prospects. Last week, if you didn't check it out, we did Tony's risers and sliders on offense. Today, we're going to look at the defensive side of the ball. Tony, I'm pumped to talk some college prospects with you, man. How are you?
I'm okay. More importantly, how are you? We want to hear your breakdown about Germany. You promised to talk about pretzels. I wanted to hear about the beer there.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing about German pretzels, while they are excellent, they're not like the warm, soft ones. They're usually not served hot, and they're not crispy, but they're not soft either. So it's like a good cross between. They were excellent. Had my fair share of beer over the course of the week, obviously, when I had some free time and I wasn't on Giants hours. But and I got to give German fans credit, man, Tony. They were into it. Giant jerseys everywhere, but jerseys of all sorts of NFL teams all over the place. I was walking around downtown on Saturday and just jerseys everywhere and fans super excited. You know, the last few teams in NFL Europe were all in Germany, and I really think they have an affinity for the game. So I think even more so than London, where I think it's more of a spectacle. I really do think there's like a legitimate NFL fan base in Germany if the league wants to make this a regular stop every year.
Yeah, well, don't say that too loud because Roger Goodell keeps talking about moving the Super Bowl overseas. That'll just give him more boost. Now, let me ask you something. Were there a lot of American fans that flew over to Germany for the game, or were the majority of the people wearing Giant jerseys German citizens?
I met a lot of people that flew over, but there were a ton of Germans wearing NFL jerseys, you know, of all teams. So I think there is a legitimate local, you know, affinity for American football. And I don't think we talked to somebody about this last week when we were out there, one of the NFL folks, and I don't think the Super Bowl is going to be in Europe anytime soon, to be honest with you. But Goodell did talk about in the next few years, maybe trying to have 16 games, one for each team in Europe every year. Or I shouldn't say in Europe, internationally, whether that's Europe, Mexico City, Brazil. They're talking about Australia, maybe Japan.
Oof.
So if you work or cover an NFL team, you better get your passport ready because everyone's going to be traveling pretty soon for these games.
One last thing on the beverages. You said the pretzels were not warm. Was the beer room temperature or cold?
Oh no, it was cold. It was cold.
Okay.
Yeah, cold beer. Has to
Oftentimes
be
they
cold
serve.
beer.
I've been there. It's room temperature, which you know,
Really?
yeah, cold pretzels and warm beer. That's not a good mix.
No, not a good mix. No, the beer in my experience was cold, so that was not an issue, and we had a great time. Germans were great hosts, and can't wait to go back. It was a lot of fun. All right, Tony. So let's talk about the weekend in college football first, and we'll start with a big SEC matchup with these two teams that are trying to get into the college football playoffs. And Ole Miss certainly helped their cause. A 28-10 win over Georgia. Both those teams now with two losses. Ole Miss at 8-2, Georgia at 7-2. And, you know, Jackson Dart, his numbers, certainly not what they were the prior week when we talked about his, what was it, 400 yards passing and 5 touchdown passes, whatever it was. But he did enough to get the
Yeah,
win against Georgia.
yeah. You missed some good games this weekend while you were enjoying your German beer and pretzels.
Yeah, I
And
told you I
this
was
was
all psyched. I'm like, Alabama, LSU. Wait, it starts at 2 a.m. I guess that's not happening.
oh, you didn't miss much with that. That was a disaster that game. But I mean, this was a must win for Mississippi. And what happened was early on, Jalen Walker, the junior linebacker, who I think has now established himself as a first round pick, they sent him upfield on the blitz. He had a great inside move. He hit the quarterback, which caused an interception. The first series that Mississippi had the ball, and you're like, Georgia's going to pounce on him with all its great talent. But what happened was Mississippi kind of settled themselves. And you talk about Jackson Dart. You got you don't know Jackson Dart was basically playing on one leg because he hurt his ankle. I believe midway through the first quarter, they took him off the field. The freshman quarterback came in, drove them down for a field goal, and Jackson Dart wasn't great, but what he did was he kept his team in the game and he kept continually move that Mississippi offense into scoring position where they would either get a touchdown or a field goal. So Dart he didn't have great numbers, but he really played a good game as opposed to Carson Beck.
Real quick,
And
Tony, I had a question for you, real quick before we go to Beck. Did Dart have that 28-yard run before or after the ankle injury?
after the ankle injury.
Wow.
After the
Okay.
ankle injury. Yeah, that was late in the game when it was still kind of close, and that 28-yard run kind of broke the gates open for Mississippi. Whereas Carson Beck, he could not convert, he could not move the field. We talk about Cam Ward, how Cam Ward always seems to have an answer. Carson Beck doesn't have an answer. Had an interception on a tip ball, didn't have his 3 interception game, but again, it's hit and miss with Carson Beck. He makes some incredible passes, and then he gets very streaky. He can't move the offense. He does a great job when his back's against the wall and they're down by 21 points, but you can't play like that every week. And he really didn't have an answer. A very uninspired play by Carson Beck, who I believe continues to tumble down draft boards. And I don't think it's out of the question that Carson Beck, who a lot of people thought would be a top 10 pick, ends up falling out of the first round because he's just not been good this year.
Why did Trevor Etienne only have 6 carries?
Well, it's kind of funny you mentioned that because early in the game, Georgia went away from the passing game and then leaned on the running game, and they were decent at it. But I think what happened was the Mississippi defensive line was just playing lights out. They got you would have thought Georgia has all that great talent in their defensive front seven on their defensive line. Well, it was Mississippi who turned the tables because human Lee Ellen. I broke that down.
Human Lee Ellen.
For
That's pretty good, Tony. Good job
Human
with
Lee
that.
Ellen had 5 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, 2 sacks. And they just couldn't stop him. I mean, the Georgia offensive line had their head on a swivel because they were being overrun by Mississippi. So I think it was the fact that they couldn't get Carson Beck going, and the Mississippi defensive line just basically did not allow Georgia to breathe.
Yeah, no question about it. Just a really nice job. Who else from this game jumped out at you, Tone?
Yeah, Jared Ivey, the big defensive end, 6'5" and a half, 283 pounds, runs in the 4.7s, had some really nice plays. He's a guy, he's got first round measurables. He plays like a top 100 pick on occasion, but he's been a little bit streaky. He's starting to turn it on now at the right time. So both him and Princely played incredibly well. I mean, the Georgia defensive line really was neutralized by Mississippi, who I thought, besides Jackson Dart, did a terrific job.
All right. Let's go over to Miami, Georgia Tech. Obviously, a bad
Yeah.
loss for Miami, their first loss of the year, 28-23. I still think they'll be in the playoff picture after this loss, Tony, but now you're one more loss. You never know what you're going to look at. And I did not see the game. As you mentioned, I was in Munich at the time change with Giants events. It was impossible. But I did see that final play from Cam Ward on the last drive, trying to come down to win the game, where he held it and kind of danced around
Right.
the pocket a little bit too relaxed, got stripped. So I sense we got like every shade of Cam Ward that you would want in this game, where you got some good 25 of 39, 348, 3 touchdowns, but then we saw some of the bad with the decision making with the turnover at the end.
Yeah, I think first of all, from a team perspective, Miami's been living on the edge. They had to pull it out late against Virginia Tech. They've had some games that they've really had to pull out late, and Georgia Tech got up early, and Miami just couldn't come back and win the game. I think you look at Ward's numbers: 25 of 39, 348 yards, 3 TDs, no interceptions. You're like, wow. But when you watch the film, he shows that great patience. He shows that great intuition, but there's just too much improvisation on his behalf, which kind of leads to disaster. You talked about the last play. I mean, he holds the ball too long. And I think he just thinks he's going to make plays, which he usually has. But oftentimes, it happened a couple times in a Georgia Tech game, he's holding the ball too long. He's getting sacked. That last sack led to a fumble, which ended the game. Georgia Tech wins. He's not going to be able to do that on Sunday. So while definitely heading in the right direction, the way Carson Beck is playing, the way Quinn Ewers is playing, the way some of the other top guys are playing, Cam Ward's obviously going to be in the conversation for the first quarterback selected, but still, that propensity to hold the ball too long, I think, is something is going to be talked about as we lead up to the draft, something that the scouts and the coaches are going to talk to Cam Ward about during those combine interviews.
And that's something that again, you can't do that in the NFL, right? You got to get the ball
No.
out in 2.7 seconds. And the other top quarterback, I know he's on your list here, but I think your comment is telling. Shador Sanders is another guy that I know he doesn't have great protection in Colorado, but he tends to hold the ball too, runs backwards sometimes. So those are two guys that those are some of the things like pocket management and timing that I think the NFL teams are going to lock in on, even though they have a ton of arm talent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing is, while we praise Cam Ward and some of his receivers as well, we should. I mean, the Miami Hurricane defense has been disastrous this year, and they've got some NFL talent. Tyler Barron, the defensive end, Akeem Mesidor, the quick, explosive defensive tackle, Francisco Muega, the inside linebacker, and they're just getting hammered. I mean, these are guys who are early to mid day three prospects, and they're getting run over by the opposition. So while we talk about Cam Ward and how his draft stock is rising, just about all of those Miami Hurricane defensive players who we thought could sneak into the late part of day two, maybe fourth round type prospects, they're all dropping down draft boards.
271 rushing yards in this game for Georgia Tech. They just pounded the ball on the ground on their way to victory. All right, Tony, Michigan, Indiana. That was a game. Obviously, Indiana's had an unbelievable season thus far in college football with their new coach, Skignetti. They're very excited, and it was a little dicey at times, but they held
Was
on for the 2015 win.
And again, Curtis Rourke, a Jackson Dart type of performance. Not great, 17 to 28, 206 yards, two TDs, one interception, but got the job done. Answered the bell and was able to answer when Indiana needed it. They were down early in that game. That Michigan defense was relentless. 2 sacks, 4 tackles for loss. They're a very talented front four. Yet Rourke stood in there. And again, we talk about these top quarterbacks, how they have disappointed. Rourke is not disappointed. He's going to be an interesting evaluation moving towards the 2025 NFL draft. I'm sure we're going to see him at a postseason game. I'm sure we're going to see him at the combine. And he's a guy who really has answered the call. Now, Indiana plays Ohio State in 2 weeks. And Ohio State has a lot of talent on the defensive front line, even in the defensive front seven. So that's going to be another telling game for Curtis Rourke, who doesn't have the greatest offensive line in front of him, yet finds ways to make plays and finds ways to move his offense down the field.
Obviously, Tony, there's still a lot of pro talent that's going to get drafted high on that Michigan defense, even though their offense have struggled this year. How do you think they performed this week?
Oh, they were. I mean, they were relentless. I mean, Rourke at times was running for his life, and they were constantly in his face. I thought Mason Graham played well. They had some good Josiah Stewart off the edge. I thought that they did a very good job. The problem with Michigan is their offense. I mean, they lost all those offensive linemen last year. They can't get the quarterback situation settled. I think the running game has been disappointing, especially compared to what it was when Jim Harbaugh was there. But then again, you look at how many of those players from last year are now on NFL rosters. The Michigan defense is real good, though.
Absolutely. You don't have it on your rundown here, Tony, but since I mentioned it briefly, I want to just touch on that Alabama LSU game. Alabama blew out LSU 42-13. And we've kind of been in on the quarterbacks over the course of this. So I want to talk about Jalen Milroe and Garrett Nussmeier in this game. And I think a lot of people like Garrett Nussmeier. I think he's got a lot of talent as well. I hope this game kind of sends the signal. Go back for another year.
Yeah.
Hone your skills. Figure things out. 27-42, 239, 2 more interceptions. He had those issues last week with the picks too, just 1 touchdown. And then Jalen Milroe. And this is, I think, the Jalen Milroe that's going to tempt people a lot because so many physical tools are there. 12 carries, 185 yards, 4 touchdowns, 72 yards on that score. I believe he got upwards of 24 miles per hour on the run, according to some of the player tracking, which equates to a high 4.3 if you translate that to a 40-yard dash. But just 12 of 18 for 109 yards through the air.
Now, you got to remember, it was raining in that game, and it was raining pretty hard at times, which I guess is sort of why they used Milroe more as a ball carrier than they did as a passer, and he destroyed him as the ball carrier. As far as Nussmeier is concerned, yeah, this was a come back to reality moment where people are talking about him being a first-round pick. No way. He's got a lot of ability, but he needs a lot more work. There were a lot of passes that were getting away from him, and basically Alabama defense finally woke up. Milroe, he's just an explosive athlete. Did miss a couple of downfield passes when I watched it because this game was over pretty early, where guys were wide open and he overthrew the guys. So that downfield accuracy is going to come into question. But I think you saw what Jalen Milroe, the potential he has, and with Nussmeier, as you said, really, I think people are just overreacting. He's been good, but he's not been great. There were too many passes that just got away from him in this game. I'll tell you what, we talked about the tackles. Will Campbell, we've talked about Will Campbell a couple times. I kept my eyes on Emory Jones, the right tackle, and I was very impressed with Emory Jones. He is what Will Campbell isn't, in the sense that he is your nasty blocker. He's always looking to bury the defender into the ground. I mean, he is playing through the whistle and after the whistle. Doesn't have great footwork in pass protection. Doesn't show that great ability to slide out off the edge. More of your traditional right tackle. But I liked a lot of what I saw from Emory Jones against an Alabama defense that finally woke up last week against LSU.
Yeah, looking at Milroe's numbers this year, he just had 2 games where he's thrown for more than 240 yards, and frankly, just 3 games where he's thrown for more than 215 yards. So I still think a lot of, and look, he is a coach that knows how to coach up the passing game. We know that, right, from when he was in Washington. So he knows how to throw the ball down the field. So I just think the tools are unbelievable, and he's an unbelievable kid by all accounts as well. People will love him in interviews and stuff like that. Jalen Milroe, unbelievable, A+ personality, teammate, all that sort of stuff. So we'll have to see what teams think of him when we get to draft time. Maybe he doesn't come out. Maybe he goes back for another year and collects that big NIL check, and we'll see him. We'll see him in 2026. Who knows?
One thing is you can see that Jalen Milroe leadership on the field, a la Jackson Dart, a la Curtis Rourke. You can see that, he is a guy that the players gravitate to, that he takes that leadership role. It's something I'm glad you brought that up when you talked about the character, because that is obvious when you watch the games, what a leader is. Going to have to be a huge NIL deal, I think, to keep him back. It's not out of the question these days, but he's going to be an early pick, and it may be good for him to go back and hone his game, but I think the NFL calling is going to be a little bit too lucrative for him to stay at Alabama. I'm sure I'll know more in the next couple of weeks.
You think right now he's going to be a first-round pick?
I think hands down he's going to be a first-round pick. I mean, listen, we've seen lesser quarterbacks go in the first round. We've seen guys who didn't have the same arm strength, didn't have the size, didn't have the running ability, were equally as the same level as far as their development as a passer. Jalen Milroe is going the top 15. So I think there's no doubt he's going to be a first round pick. I think he's going to be a top half of round 1 pick.
Moody's is a proud partner of the New York Giants, uniting the brightest minds to turn today's risks into tomorrow's opportunities. Learn more at Moody's.com. All right, Tony, let's get to your risers and sliders on the defensive side of the ball. Let's start up front with the big fellas. We'll start with Walter Nolen, a guy that you've talked about a few different times over the course of this program. He's having a nice little year for Mississippi.
Yeah, not just a big body in the middle of the line, but someone who makes a lot of plays. 32 tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, 4 sacks. Very athletic when you watch him. Penetrates the line of scrimmage, easily changes direction, can pursue plays out to the flanks. There was one play on a fumble Saturday against Georgia where he was out in the sidelines, made the fumble recovery. So, he was a guy who a lot of people thought had first-round talent coming into the season. I think he's definitely moved into the top 20 if he enters the draft, and I'd be surprised if he doesn't enter the draft.
Smaller school. How about Michael Green out of Marshall, Tony?
Yeah, I mean, here's a guy that no one talks about. I'm told he's definitely entering the draft. 33 tackles, 14.5 tackles for loss, 10 sacks. He's a taller, thinner pass rusher, comes out of a three-point stance, can stand over tackle, fluid moving around the field, shows ability backed off the line of scrimmage. If your team needs an edge rusher and you are not familiar with Michael Green, start watching Marshall football. I think he's going to enter the draft, and he's going to be a day 2 pick.
Now, Tony, this is the name I'm not familiar with, so I'm excited to talk about him. Ty Robinson out of Nebraska, 6'5", over 300 pounds.
And very athletic. Is expected to run a low 4.5s. Entered the season as a late-round pick.
Time out. Low 4.5s? You mean low 5.0s, right?
Low 5.0. I'm sorry.
Okay, I was going to say 3'11", 4.5. He might be the first pick in the draft. Holy shit.
Entered the season. Thank you. Entered the season as a late-round pick. 9 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, always making plays. And if you watch Nebraska, they line them up all over that defensive line. They line them up out on the edge. They line him up over nose tackle, at nose tackle. They line him up at defensive tackle, a guy that can be a defensive end in a three-man front. He could be a defensive tackle. Your inside guy can play end in a four-man front. Excuse me, just somebody who does everything very well and consistently makes plays against talented offensive linemen. I think Robinson is a guy who came into the season graded as a seventh rounder. You're looking at early day 3, possibly late day 2.
All right, then you have two other guys up front that you wanted to touch on.
Yeah, these are your natural nose tackles, zero technique guys. Jordan Phillips out of Maryland, 6'3", 320 pounds. Dom Orange out of Iowa State, 6'4", 325. Orange is a guy who's had a really, really good season, really came out of nowhere, where Jordan Phillips showed a lot of ability last year. Pretty sure Phillips is going to enter the draft. I heard Orange could enter the draft. You're probably looking at maybe third round, but more likely early day 3. Your natural, zero technique nose tackle type of defensive lineman.
All right, and now how about a couple of guys that maybe have not met expectations? One guy that we talked about maybe is a potential day 2 pick last year in Ashton Gillott.
Yeah, I mean, last year, 14 and a half tackles for loss, 11 sacks. This year, 5.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks. Worst numbers since his freshman season. He's a guy, when you watch Louisville, he's nowhere to be found. Where last year he was unstoppable. And, he's gone from a potential day 2 pick, probably second half of day 3, because he's just not shown up this year.
And then we've talked about how good South Carolina's defensive line has been this year, Tony, and their front has been dominant. But there's one player that some injuries, he hasn't played as much, that maybe not so much.
DeAndre Jules, the transfer from Pitt, he was supposed to be a rotational guy. They got Tonka Hemingway in there, TJ Sanders, both good players. Jules was supposed to be a rotational guy. He had some injury issues last year at Pittsburgh, entered the draft with day 2 grades. He's played, I believe, 5 games this year, has not played since October. So obviously his draft stock is going to drop.
Okay, now we got a couple of guys on the edge, Tony, that you think have really stepped up their game, and I want to see you try to pronounce 2 of these names. I'm looking forward to that the most, I think, Tony. But why don't we start with Jalen Walker?
Yeah, I mean, Walker, all you got to do is watch Georgia, and he's all over the place. And this was somebody that over the summer I watched him, and he was a rotational linebacker for Georgia in 2023, and he's just elevated his game. He's going to be a first-round pick. People are going to brand him as an edge rusher, as I did here. Probably I shouldn't have, but he can do everything. He can drop off the line of scrimmage. He can play in pass coverage. He can run down opponents in pursuit. And a guy that, like I said, he started off that Mississippi game with a great inside rush, caused the interception, but he's a lot more than that. And I would expect Walker probably to enter the draft. If he does, I think he's going to be a bottom half of round 1 guy.
All right, and then okay, I'm going to try the first one. Oluwafemi Oladejo.
There you go. I think that's right on. That's right on. Another smaller sort of edge rusher that can stand over tackle, come out of a 3-point stance, 6'3", 255 pounds, easily moves around the field. Against Penn State, he had 10 tackles, 2 tackles for loss, and a sack. Had 4 tackles for loss and 2 sacks last Friday night against Iowa. That UCLA team with Deshaun Foster as a head coach is starting to get into gear. Oladejo has been a real good player all along. More than just a pass rusher, a guy who can play off the line of scrimmage. He's shown ability in space, potential day 2 pick. Entered the season as like a 6th or 7th round prospect, so he's improved his stock by at least 4 rounds.
Then how about Boston College? Donovan Ezeiruaku.
Donovan, not the guy who's saying sunshine Superman, but a guy who looks like a Superman on the football field. I mean, this is one of the most underrated pass rushers in the nation. 14 tackles for loss, 11 sacks, 3 forced fumbles. He was a good player last year. He's not just a one-year wonder. If you watch Boston College last year, he was all over the place making plays. But again, 6'2.5", 245 pounds, probably going to run the 40 and the 4.7, so he doesn't have those great measurables. So what you're doing is you're projecting him as a situational pass rusher at the next level, at least early on, which is why I think he's a day 3 pick, but just a terrific football player.
All right, and then you have Josiah Stewart out of Michigan, Tony. This is a guy that I think coming into this year we had high hopes for.
Yeah, I think the next 3 guys on the list are basically real good pass rushers. but they just don't have great size and
Yeah,
speed.
go through them.
So they all kind of fit together in the late rounds. Josiah Stewart, 6'1", 241 pounds, runs in the 4.7s, 11 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks this year. I mentioned him earlier in the Indiana game, constantly getting pressure, constantly making plays up the field. But these are guys who are going to have to learn to make plays off the line in space. Antoine Powell Ryland of Virginia Tech, same sort of situation. Entered the season with priority free agent grades, 14 and a half tackles for loss this year, 13 sacks. Last year, 14 and a half tackles, 9 sacks. If you watch the Virginia Tech program, they have a history of these smaller one gap defensive ends, these smaller edge rushers. Antoine Powell Ryland fits that mold. It's going to be a late round pick. And then Kyle Kennard. I mean, Kyle Kennard, in some areas of the scouting community, was graded as a reject. A guy who had no chance. 13 and a half tackles for loss, 9.5 sacks. If you watch him, he handled Will Campbell of LSU pretty well early this season. And a guy who, if he runs in the 4.9s at the combine or pro day workouts, which some people think he's going to be a 4.9 guy, he's not going to get drafted. If he runs in the low 4.8s, high 4.7s, you're looking at a late round pick, which people say, wow, great late round pick. But he was off the charts coming into the season. He's had a great year.
All right, now let's go to some of your sliders at the edge position, Tony. These are some of the guys on our first couple shows.
Yeah.
We were talking about potential top 10 picks here.
Some people thought James Pierce of Tennessee was going to be the first pick of the draft. I mean, 7.5 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks. The thing that concerns me about Pierce is when you look at him, he's just a tall, thin guy. He looks like a small guy. So, you're going to have to really protect him at the next level. Still think he's a first round pick, but this was someone who was projected as the potential first pick of the draft. Then you have the duo at Ohio State, JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, who are playing in dribs and drabs. I mean, sometimes they show up, sometimes they disappear. Very streaky for two guys who are supposed to be very talented. I think the defensive tackles at Ohio State have played well, but these guys have not lived up to expectations, and their draft stock, as a result, has taken a hit. And then Patrick Payton of Florida State. I mean, it's been a disastrous season for Florida State, really from the get-go. Patrick Payton, there were people such as myself who thought if he had a big year, he could move into the late part of round one. 4 sacks this year. At times, he looks like he'd rather be out fishing or, playing video games or something rather than being on the football field. That's going to be something that's discussed with him in the offseason. But Patrick Payton is a guy who, even if you didn't think he was a first-round pick, he's a day 2 pick. He's now fallen into the later rounds.
All right, let's go to the linebacker position, Tony, a position that I think the NFL is dying for some real talent at that off-ball interior linebacker spot. Who are two guys that have really kind of stepped up this year?
Which is kind of funny because it's been so ignored and dismissed and marginalized in recent years. I mean, Nick Martin of Oklahoma State was on fire early in the season until he injured his knee 5 games in. 47 tackles in 5 games, 7.5 tackles for loss. A guy who made plays up the field, a guy who made plays in pursuit. He was all over the place. You couldn't stop him. He was absolutely explosive. We'll have to see what happens with that right knee injury. I know they haven't ruled him out for the rest of the season, although Oklahoma State is not having a good campaign. But a guy who, really came out of nowhere. Not much was expected from him. And he showed himself to be a real good 3-down linebacker, not just up the field, but also in space. And then Sonny Styles of Ohio State, the former safety, 6'4", 240 pounds, runs in the 4.6s, 57 tackles this year, really learning to play more up in the box in a confined area as opposed to roaming the field at safety, has shown a lot of improvement in his game, and he's got outstanding measurables.
All right, let's go to the defensive back position, Tony. A position where I think NFL teams always looking for corners. You have 4 guys here that you've liked the work that they've put in this year.
And they're primarily safeties as opposed to corners. So you start off with Xavier Scott of Illinois. I mean, Illinois in recent years has become almost, DBU, if you will. They put so many good defensive backs into the league. Xavier Scott, 3 interceptions, 7 pass breakups this year. A year ago, he had 13 pass breakups. When I watched the film over the summer, I was like, who is this guy constantly making plays on the ball? It's getting to the point where opposing quarterbacks don't even throw in his direction. Now, the thing with Scott is he's probably not going to measure much more than 5'10". He's not going to hit that, that's that 6 foot even mark that a lot of teams want. Does that downgrade his draft stock a little bit? I'll tell you what, he's an outstanding cover corner, can play bump and run, can play zone, can play backed off the line of scrimmage. Nick Emanawari, somebody I've mentioned before, same. These two guys kind of fit in the same mold. Nick Emanawari of South Carolina, Malik Verdon of Iowa, linebacker size safeties. I mean, these are guys who go 6'2", 215, 220 pounds. Emanawari of South Carolina, 60 tackles, six pass breakups, 4 interceptions, 2 TDs. Verdon of Iowa State's got 58 tackles, 5 pass breakups. They're not natural free safeties. They're more, I don't want to say traditional strong safeties, but I think they're guys that you can use in sort of a zone system. If you're going to if you're going to use your safeties to cover a third of the field, they can do that playing downhill. They've got excellent cover skills. I mean, you just look at the numbers, you watch the film, they can cover. They're not a liability in coverage. The question is, will teams see them as safeties or potential one gap linebackers? But they're real good football players. Isaiah Nakobe of SMU kind of gets lost in the shuffle. He's more of your natural safety. 64 tackles this year, shows a lot of ball skills. All those guys that I just mentioned, the juniors, starting with Scott, I think there's a good chance that all of them enter the draft. Maybe Noah Kobe from SMU goes back to school. But these are all guys who I think are top 100, top 125 talents, with Xavier Scott being someone who could potentially fit into the late part of round one.
And I guess it should not surprise us, Tony, that the one guy on your slider list for defensive backs is Ohio State corner Denzel Burke. We've talked about the last few weeks. That has had some issues covering some of the better receivers in college football.
And this seems to be a tradition with Ohio State. You get a highly rated cornerback who's going to enter his final year in college, and then he disappoints. We've seen it, Eli Apple. We've seen all these guys who don't play well their last year in college. And Denzel Burke has just gotten beaten time and time again. You watch the Denzel Burke in 2023, and he was a much better cornerback a year ago than he was this year, making plays, the ability to make plays with his back to the ball, not getting burnt. It's not been a good year for Denzel Burke, who a lot of people, including myself, thought had first-round potential. But I think right now you're looking at best, a third-round prospect.
All right, those are our risers and sliders on defense, Tony. Before we say goodbye, Tony, what is your overall take on the defensive side of the ball of this draft class? Where are the strengths, where are the weaknesses, and what do you think of the group in general?
I like the defensive line. I like the defensive tackle class. I think there are some solid edge rushers. The linebacker class is going to be disappointing, but that's because I think the position has been marginalized to a large extent. They take these undersized guys, and rather than using them as linebackers, they use them up the field as pass rushers. I think the cornerback class is questionable. I liked it coming into the season, but I think there have been some, uninspired play, like I mentioned with Denzel Burke. Your top 2 guys are injured right now, so we're going to have to wait and see what happens with the cornerback position, which is questionable.
All right, can't wait to see it. So next week, I already have it scheduled. We're gonna have Dane Brugler join us. We're gonna record at our usual time on Tuesday. It'll probably air on Wednesday. His updated top 50 list came out. Tony, I think you're gonna like his third overall player. It's a guy you love and you've talked about a lot. Take a guess. Who do you think it is?
Jalen Milroe.
No, Abdul Carter.
All right, good. Well, Abdul Carter's my number 1 guy, so that's good to hear.
I know.
Good to hear.
People beating you to the bandwagon, Tony, or jumping on the bandwagon with you.
There you go.
With him there. So we like to see that. Yeah. Dane's one of our favorite people. So he'll be with us next week at 11. And then I think we're going to take Thanksgiving week off like we did for the last short week we had here. And then Tony and I will be with you every week from then on until the NFL draft. So make sure you hang with us. We'll start getting the college football conference championship games. We'll have the college football playoff, which Tony will be great. He'll give us like 4 weeks of content with all those great playoff games. That'll be wonderful. We'll have all that. Or 3 weeks. How long is the college football playoff? 3 weeks? 4 weeks?
I think it's 4.
4, right? I think it is 4. So we'll have all that for you as we continue to cover college football and the NFL draft for you right here. You can find draft season, of course, on the Giants app. You can find it at giants.com/podcast. Remember, this is a draft podcast. It's not a Giants podcast. So just search for draft season on your favorite podcast platform and it will arrive. Tony, anything fans should be keeping an eye on at Sportskeeda that you have going up in the next couple days or just went up?
No, well, yeah, I think the thing to keep an eye on are the underclassmen, the news on the underclassmen, which underclassmen I'm hearing are going to enter the draft, which underclassmen have already committed to an agent. There was a story published on Saturday. All four underclassmen, all the top underclassmen from Michigan, I'm told, are have decided on representation are going to enter the draft. Mason Graham, the defensive tackle, Kenneth Grant, the defensive tackle, Will Johnson, the cornerback, who's been struggling with injury, and Colston Loveland, the tight end, who'll be the first tight end off the board. I'm told all four of those guys are going to enter the draft. We'll have another article this week, so that'll be the big news for the next for a month or so until college football season ends as to which underclassmen are expected to enter the draft. A little trickier this year as well as last year because, as you mentioned earlier, those NIL packages can be attractive and pull those guys back in.
Tony, good stuff, my friend. I appreciate it.
Look forward to next week, John.
Me too. We'll have Dane Brugler with us right here on Draft Season, presented by Moody's, a proud partner of the New York Giants. Decode risk, unlock opportunity. Learn more at moodys.com. We'll see you next week, everybody.